Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webcast today, sponsored by Comcast Spotlight. The topic of today's webcast is Make Audience-Based TV Advertising Work for You with this simple equation. And we'll review exactly what that equation is in just a few moments. I'm Christopher Hosford with the Ad Age team. Let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to each of our panelists today. Andrea Zapata is Comcast Spotlight's Research and Insights Vice President. Matt Emmons is the co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Data Plus Math. And Stephen Eidelman is Director of Addressable Sales at One-to-One Media. I really thank all of you for being with us today and sharing your insights. First up is Andrea. She oversees Comcast Spotlight's data innovation and measurement team, as well as the in-market client research team. She also leads Spotlight's work to bring innovative, unique research solutions to the market. So now let's get into it. Andrea, you have said that it isn't really news that TV advertising has shifted to audience-based buying. Tell us a little bit about why it has, and what's the best way marketers can go about buying audiences?
Yeah, hello there. So thanks, Chris. Appreciate the introduction, and hello, everyone out there. So yes, it is pretty evident that TV ad buying is moving away from television in the traditional methods that we try to reach customers across television video. The idea that day parts, networks, and programs are the best ways to reach our customer are no longer as relevant as they once were when we live in a data-rich world like we do now. So this topic of audience is actually very near and dear to my heart. I actually spent the first 8 years of my career at ESPN, so I like to say I cut my teeth in the land of television where content was king, we were multi-platform, and storytelling was at the core of what we did. I then spent the last 6 years on the digital side, a vastly different world. While we had great content, we didn't necessarily always have the scale, but what we did have was data, and data allowed us to have a much more audience-based approach when it came to talking to planners and buyers. So for example, on the digital side, nobody would say to a publisher, are you up or down year to year? How are your ratings? Can I please buy this particular part of your news feed per se? Instead, it was really based on audience delivery. Now that I'm back in television, which I must say, this is the best time to be back in television, we are now working with very real fire. It is awesome to see that TV is embracing a more data-driven approach that can actually be very rooted in audience. So this is a digital-like tactic that now in the world of television we can bring to marketers and advertisers the scale that is very specific to television. We reach everyone, day in and day out, right? The quality of our content, I like to say we wake up in the morning and it is premium all day, every day. It is TV content. And now we actually have the breadth of data that allows us to become much more precise in the delivery of your customer. So now it's time to start moving away from the day part, the network, the proxies that we've used to reach audiences in the past, and instead of pigeonholing how to reach audiences, instead take what I call a user's use approach. How are audiences, how are your customers consuming content across screens, and how can we more precisely deliver either your broad reach with a precise segment on top or get really specific and reach your segment. Again, this is fairly new to television, but not as fairly new as we like to think, and it's exciting for us to be able to have a conversation where we believe the equation is indeed fairly simple. We think it's all about the audience, the data, and the content. So a good audience-based buying approach should encompass a more practical targeted philosophy with audience-based planning, but all things considered, you don't drive success when it's just all about the audience methodology alone. There are a couple more facets for us to consider. I think it's actually 3 parts in the sense that, again, audience at scale is really key. Understanding how they consume content across devices, across networks, across day parts, not necessarily to limit how you reach them, but instead to expand and understand consumer consumption. It's then having the right data sets. Here in the world of television, we now have set-top box data. That set-top box data allows us to understand viewership on a day-in, minute-by-minute basis, but that information alone isn't enough for us to be smart about how to target your consumer. So we need to marry that viewership data with third-party segments like Polk for auto intenders or Experian or even L2 for political data that allows us to give us characteristics to that audience within a household. And then ultimately, it goes back to what keeps them coming back to television, understanding the power of storytelling, the beauty of the content, and the engagement, the stickiness in that long-form content. So again, having the right data sets is key to not only knowing who your consumers and viewers are, but what their interests and characteristics are, which informs purchase behavior and ultimately allows us to get much more precise in delivering your goals. So the deal is, right now, you guys, is that fragmentation is a very real thing. With the onset of technology providing choice and allowing us to view content at any given moment, we know that screens are indeed pulling media apart. I say media apart, not pulling the love of content and great content apart. In fact, it's only increasing it, but how we reach our audience has become much more challenging. When we think about actually reaching our audiences, we can put them back together when we think about who is it that we're trying to reach and take out of the equation, do I reach them on a television set, a mobile device, a PC, or I'm trying to think of that, a PC, a desktop, regardless of device. We think that if you're just focused on reaching an audience, you can eliminate all of those factors completely. Now, being a researcher and having grown up in the school of ESPN research, I like to always go back to this idea of audience. So how many, how often, how long. Very important for us to think about who it is that we're reaching and asking ourselves always about not only engagement from the how many and the how often, which can be either impressions or ratings. Is it unduplicated? Are these screens enhancing my ability to reach an unduplicated viewer? The frequency and the balance of that message, the time spent, the composition, and obviously the viewability. These are very basic, blunt metrics that are the counting side of the house. And in the world of television, where I think we have been a little more hesitant, but we are now becoming much more sophisticated in our conversation, is when we've reached said audience and we've done it this many times for this long, did it have an impact? Did that person, that customer, actually remember my ad? Did they like my ad? And did they ultimately not only consider my product, but then did they go in store? Did they purchase a car? Did they search my product? Our ability in the world of television and video as a whole to be able to say we are a full funnel solution that starts with reaching the right audience can actually have much greater impact on the actual efficacy of said campaign. So first things first, having spent the last 6 years in digital, I want to just say full stop. Despite the headlines, audience still heart television. They spend a ton of time with it day in and day out. The difference is, though, is how we watch television, how we measure it, and ultimately how we inform. How we watch, we'll get into. How we measure, especially here at Comcast Spotlight, because of the access to the data we have, I believe we have a responsibility to help enhance the current third-party measures that are out there that are more rooted in a panel-based methodology and enhancing their panel with our first-party data to get at the more granular behavior and viewing that happens not only at a national, regional, but also at the most local of levels. And we've done this with Nielsen and made the announcement late last year, and we're excited to be able to say that we can use data to help enhance how we currently measure audience consumption across screens. And then also, if we can measure better and understand their consumption, it's then ultimately our responsibility to help the planners and the buyers of the world understand how to best buy, plan and buy television, right? How to best reach people across videos and screens. So what we know right now is that more time is being spent with media content than ever before. How this is possible is just crazy, but it is a testament to technology. It is a testament to the desire for audiences to want to get at great content. One thing to note, though, so when we talk about embracing audiences, that essentially media usage, while it is increasing, it has become more fragmented, but TV does indeed still account for 81% of all video usage. I think that's mostly because it's long form. It's sticky in its nature. It's 24 minutes, it's 48 minutes, right? And people like to binge it. It's something that people have been doing for such a long time. So our ability to account for 81% of all video usage day in and day out is still very remarkable and something we shouldn't lose focus on. But ultimately, how you reach these audiences in a way that has scale has vastly changed. I used to say, in the early 2000s, it took 4 networks to reach half a person's 25 to 54. You basically bought Thursday night, maybe NBC, must-see TV, you got Seinfeld, you got Friends, and you called it a day, right? It's changed. Things have gotten much harder. And so when we fast forward to 2017, it now takes 20 networks to reach the same amount of people. And what's interesting to note, it is not the same 20 networks to reach your customer. All those 20 networks are actually different based on who you're trying to reach, right? So ultimately thinking about the fact that this has become a vastly different game, and we are not huddling around screens anymore as we once did, but instead we're choosing what we believe is the most interesting content for us to watch at that moment, at that time. To emphasize that it's gotten more complicated, why not give you a really scary wheel chart? So I'll break this down for you guys. This is, again, just looking at television consumption, bird's eye view, the time spent with the traditional broadcast networks, our premium networks, and then also with cable networks. We know that if you just chose 10 networks to try to reach your customer, there'd be billions of unique combinations to reach her or him. When I look at this, I call it like a dial. In my head, it's a dial. All the choices that as a content consumer, a content lover, this is choice. This is beautiful. This is a beautiful place to exist if you like content. However, if you're a media planner or buyer and you're trying to access this funnel and try to figure out how do you reach them, our data in the world of television can now actually take some of the complexity out of it. So for example, traditionally you would want to reach her by maybe buying a little bit of Bravo, a little HGTV, maybe some ESPN because there's some co-viewing happening. But ultimately, with the power of the data that we now have in the world of television, we can take that guesswork out. So we can ultimately say, she may be watching Bravo, she may be watching ABC Family, she may be watching the Clue Network. We don't judge her, but we deliver her in full. And our ability to actually understand how she's consuming across this dial is really the game changer when it comes to the television data-driven world, but also our ability to really embrace the audience approach. The need to change approach to scale is become very clear. With the wide breadth of viewing, marketers need a more targeted approach to reach scale. We here at Comcast Spotlight, but also everywhere else in the world of television, is now having access to set-top box data, which can help you reach your audiences in a really complex environment. So just so we can get really specific as to what it is that we're working with here at Comcast, I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, but I always like to say, not all data is created equal. We're working in a land where we are data rich, and that data richness is powered by audience at scale against really beautiful television content. When it comes to the data points, though, we are looking at trillions of viewing events per year. That's lots of episodes and programs being consumed, billions of hours of viewing engagement per month. Again, it goes back to the long-form nature of the content that we deliver. At Comcast, we are nearly national in our footprint, so 39 states and 79 DMAs. I think most importantly, though, it's the power of our ability to get very granular at the zone level. Either we can go national, regional, or start at the zip code zone level and then work our way up and really get geo-targeted on how we understand consumption in your backyard and then compare it to the rest of the marketplace. But the data, again, like I said earlier, doesn't mean anything unless we can attach viewer segments to it, to give it characteristics, to give it color, to actually talk about are they in the market to buy a product or not. So for us here, we've been talking about looking at audience TV viewing for national, regional, and local clients for quite a while, and we're excited to say that the day is finally here, and Comcast Spotlight is willing to share and open to sharing what we're learning. We want to start very base level and just start about how much time people are spending with television, and again, it goes back to that bird's eye view. Just so I'm clear about set-top box data, it's not just a lot of numbers. This is what we're capturing. We're capturing a live linear TV experience, DVR, VOD, so any of that on-demand binging consumption that's happening, and it is also inclusive of IP. So for the first time, through our own internal data, we now have the ability to understand how different audiences are watching television, and we're going to share a little bit with what we're learning right now. So the set-top box data informs us about actual viewing. Again, no surprise that people are spending a ton of time with television on a national or local basis. You can see the time here spent in a delayed fashion. But we want to get away from just how is a market or how is a very base, and I say market here because we could put persons 25 to 54, but it is just as broad as saying Chicago. We want to get into the conversation of how is the Chicago auto intender, the truck intender, the luxury vehicle intender, has a car in their garage that they're looking to replace in the next 6 months, and not just at the Chicago market level, but ultimately particularly in your zone, right? So understanding how people are viewing and the time spent with consumption day in and day out is important. We like to say that we can look at this also not just at the most largest of markets. It's always very great if we can get granular data in the top 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 markets, but it is so much better. We could shed a light on television consumption at the tinier markets, right? In the Albuquerques, the Colorado Springs, I like to say the Tupelos of the world. Those markets have been typically underserved when it comes to understanding how people are consuming media at the local levels, and with the granularity of our data, we are able to shed a light on that consumption. So we know how audiences are spending their time, whether it's with cable, broadcast, or premium. And so, for example, I want to break down the image we gave you earlier, where in Chicago, 70% of time is being spent with cable, 26% with broadcast. That's important to know. Sure, that's great. But what is the auto intender? How are they spending their time? Are they spending a little more time with cable versus broadcast? Are they doing more time shifting? Are they binging more than others? Again, that's the kind of data that we can bring to light to bring characteristic and behavior to you. But then also, consumption by day part. You want to reach the truck intender, we can tell you how they're viewing, not just across linear cable, but against sports, against local news, and again, in that VOD environment, that video on demand environment that currently doesn't have any visibility into it from a third-party measure. What this data is allowing us to do is actually just debunk some myths. Some things that we knew in our gut to be good and true is that, people aren't just watching in prime time, right? 60% of all linear time viewing is spent outside of that very small prime window. And in fact, if you were to just pull a ranker to reach your intended audience or your intended customer, and you chose the top 5, and I like to say, little TNT, TBS, USA, a little CNN, and maybe some HGTV, right? You would actually be leaving 85% of all television consumption and engagement on the table. That ranker approach of just using it as a proxy to reach your audience is no longer the best way to get your results. So the way that we're looking at data and marrying it and making it much more applicable to our customers is, again, making sure that our recommendations are driven by data, by using data that is not only privy to us, so first-party data, but making sure that we're marrying it to third-party data, predictor data. So we would build, for example, this is an auto example. We build your plan based on data. And when I say this is our example, this is what television can now do. We can look at the poll predictor data. We can marry it to our set-top viewership data. We can then look at which networks are going to be most likely to reach your customer, whether it's a Chevrolet target or an Acura target, and we can do this at a national, regional, and most local of zone level. And there's a lot of power in that because it's no longer how did people watch television this time yesterday or this time last week or this time last year. It's more about who are you trying to reach and how can we, now in this more data-driven, audience-based world, reach your customer for you and deliver. So Chris, with all of that information, I'm going to hand it back to you so that way we can get some color on the technology side of the house and other practices.
That sounds great, Andrea. Thanks so much. Well, you covered in a wonderful way all three areas of the equation from a macro perspective. And as I heard them, one, the need to embrace the audience regardless of screen. Second, the importance of data sets, which you can really burrow down into. And, of course, content granularity. Now it's time to dive into the data piece a bit more because it really does inform audience-based TV campaigns overall. Next up is Matt. He's responsible for data science, engineering, and product functions at Data Plus Math. He has vast experience in the development and launch of innovative advanced advertising and data-driven products in the media industry. Well, Matt, all accounts say you're a real data expert, and I know that to be true. When it comes to the data sets TV advertisers need to keep in mind, Andrea talked to us about viewership data. Now, what about this viewership data and its evolution is so important? What do you think, Matt?
Chris, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm excited to be able to pick up the conversation from Andrea and really drill into data and where we see data being able to take television. And to do that, I want to start with just a brief overview of where we've been and where I think we're going as an industry with data. For the last 50 years or so, the panels have done a great job of measuring whether a particular brand's demographic target has been reached. And TV and the other ways that TV are delivered, that content has really been valued on the basis of, did I reach my demo target? And over the last several years, set-top box data and data collected from smart TVs at a census level, when it's matched against the predictor data that Andrea talked about from Polk or Experian or others, gives us an opportunity to measure whether a brand and their TV campaign has really reached their true consumer targets. Have they reached the people who are in market for a particular product? And what I would posit, and one of the most exciting things that we've seen, is that this data now gives us the opportunity to go further than that and measure whether those messages, whether the campaign that's been deployed by the brand is actually having an impact on that brand's business. And we think about this as outcome attribution and as attributing actual business results back to the TV campaign that has been run. And so my vision for TV and this data and where we're going from a measurement standpoint is that metrics will evolve to the place where we're really able to close the loop and measure in a timely way whether multi-screen TV advertising is driving outcomes, and using that data, because we know it drives outcomes for brands, but using that data to fine-tune the target and the placement and the frequency and timing in which we deliver the message to consumers at the end of the day. So let's talk a little bit more about that. It's easier said than done. We know that consumers are reached across a lot of different screens by a brand's message. And there's a real tendency out there today to connect those outcomes at the end of the day with the thing that has been exposed or the consumer's last touched by that messaging. This is kind of a fun cartoon that I think illustrates the problem. here's a consumer that's been reached across a number of screens and different media by a shoe ad, and the last thing that they did was click on a mobile ad, and a lot of analytics would provide all the credit to that last click. And we know that all of those other exposures that they've had across their journey are really important to their final decision. And so our challenge is to use the data in such a way that we manage to understand the true impact of all of those different exposures on the consumer's journey. And I like to think about this as putting together the various signals that exist in the environment from a consumer around what they watch and what they do after they've been exposed to an ad. And they're, in our digitally connected environment today, there really are a lot of different signals. And the trick is to combine them in a way in which we can connect together those ad exposures to who the consumer is in an anonymous fashion, and to then what they have done after viewing the brand's message. And so, I've got a chart up that allows us to look at the fact that a consumer may be exposed and measured with smart TV data. They may have been exposed on a mobile or tablet. There are full episode players deployed today by the programmers. All of these things can be measured to different extents by some of this data we've talked about today. We happen today to partner with Experian and LiveRamp to connect those in a privacy-safe way back to various outcome signals, but there are multiple ways to do that. And those exposures can then be connected at an individual or household level back together with things like, did they visit a brand's website? Did they walk into a particular restaurant or retail location by measuring foot traffic with mobile location data? Did they register a new car? Or with an advertiser's first-party data recording transactions at a person's or household level. All of these signals give us a way to understand whether those ad exposures are driving the results that they're looking for, and whether and which parts of their campaign are having the best impact. And so a question that I get a lot when I talk about attribution and doing attribution in a multi-screen environment is that consumers are really exposed in a lot of different environments. And how do I understand which ones of these various exposures have driven the outcome or are most important to that? And so there's a technique that we use and that is used now in the industry called multi-touch modeling, where we're able to collect data from a whole number of different data points. So this technique really only works with very large data sets, like the data sets that we have been talking about on this call, where we can collect from millions of households or millions of individuals the environments that they've been exposed to, and then train a model that represents essentially their exposure and choice, or the way they react to those marketing stimulus, and use that model to try to understand the connection between those various features or those various points of exposure to their final outcome, and understand the way that each one of those touch points change their conversion probability at the end of the day. So this model allows us to decompose essentially the credit that should be given to those different environments or different platforms or different programming in their journey to making a purchase decision. So what do I get out of this? The power of this kind of measurement is that I can decompose a campaign into understanding not just that television works and drives results for my brand, but to tactically understand which parts of my campaign are working hardest and where I might be able to improve through different creative treatment, higher frequencies, different timing, different creative sequencing. All of these kinds of tactics that are deployed as part of a campaign can be measured using attribution and decomposed. So here are a couple examples in terms of things that a brand might be able to learn from using attribution. And here we were able to help the brand understand that certain days of the week or certain day parts were working harder, and that this helps them redistribute the impressions that have been deployed as part of their campaign. We're really excited that data can be used this way and that we can push the conversation forward with these new metrics. And on that note, I'd like to hand the discussion back to you, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Matt. A terrific discussion on multi-touch analysis, and I love that cartoon about the last click conundrum that marketers have had to face for so long. So difficult to address, and so nice to see that technology and data is helping solve that. And now we'll move on to Stephen Eidelman. Stephen joins us from One-to-One Media, which is a national addressable advertising platform that offers both agencies and marketers a turnkey solution to addressable video. One-to-One buys targeted audiences across all cable and satellite partners, and Comcast is one of them. Well, welcome, Stephen. Tell us, what's your take on all of this? We've talked about the three layers of the equation that Andrea has mentioned, and then on to a more granular discussion by Matt about data. Is there anything that can be added into the mix?
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I would say at the backbone of everything else we're doing really comes down to technology. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, so technology really kind of helps to connect the dots. So I apologize in advance for this eye chart, but this is really the big picture of it, audience-based buying, as the ecosystem continues to shake out. Despite the complexity, this is really the most exciting time to work in the space because there's an explosion of great content delivered across screens, consumed across all devices, and television has and continues to be one of the most powerful media channels. Data tells us this. Finding your high-valued audiences using data, delivering specific messaging using technology is a great equalizer to help tie the pieces of the puzzle together. To be clear, TV is not becoming digital, but it's certainly becoming far more nimble. Despite this fragmentation in the ecosystem, data allows us to maximize the impact of our campaigns by achieving maximum scale against your target audience. By combining viewership data, similar to the set-top box data that we spoke about, with first and third-party category data allows you to confidently plan your reach and frequency holistically. And more importantly, it allows a media campaign to be bought against a brand's KPI instead of just traditional TV metrics like GRPs. Really, it's about extracting maximum value at scale. We believe that there will be more change in television in the next 2 years than there's been in the last 20. And for those of us entrenched in it, navigating all these permutations of content and data sources can prove to be cumbersome. Old school intuition buying on Nielsen demos serves its purpose, but it's not the only way. In our new multi-screen world, navigating all of the options requires data and technology to move from the testing phase to incorporating this as a data-driven marketing strategy. Using technology allows us to take a step back and connect the dots across audience, data, and content. And really, we see that the majority of our clients return after their first addressable campaign, and post-campaign measurement is exactly why. Digital has created an expectation of accountability, and audience-based buying on television answers all of the questions that brands are looking to answer. Did we sell more cars? Did we put more heads in beds? Using viewership data with category data is where I can actually show if there was a lift in sales, if we got people to go to the website more, or if they actually physically visited a location using mobile location data. Tying all those dots together is really what helps brands move to the next generation of television buying. and taking those learnings to plug them back in to better inform their strategies going forward. Really better understanding what a brand can afford to pay using their sales data. Are there more responsive subgroups within your audience that you should be focusing on for future campaigns? What are the networks and day parts that are driving the highest sales? Having this data allows us in the space not to just answer, did my campaign work, but to dive deeper into actionable learnings for the future. Those are my thoughts. Chris?
That sounds great, Stephen. Thank you so much for that added layer of technology, underscoring the three main components of the audience-based advertising equation. That's really, let's face it, so important. Well, at this point of the program, we'd like to open the floor for questions from those of you watching this webcast today. First up, this question is probably best tailored for Andrea. Very straightforward. Andrea, does addressable TV work for every client? Really loved your analysis of what works for Chevrolet versus what works for a competing auto manufacturer. What's your opinion? Does addressable TV work for every client, and how can you parse that?
Yeah, so hi there. I'm a big believer that you've got to understand how to use TV, which is in the sense of that it's going to reach, you're going to be able to reach a lot of people in a short, finite window of time, and that is important, right? You want people to understand and see and recognize your brand, so they can eventually like your brand and then consider it. Where I see addressable coming in is it's another lever of getting more refined in your approach to reaching a more nuanced, niche, or granular target, right? So I'm sort of one of those foundational of make sure that you reach as many people as you possibly can first, and then layer on different tactics to get much more specific in reaching your end goal. But it all goes back to what are your KPIs, right? And that's the beauty of an audience-based approach, is that we can actually look and say, who are you trying to reach? And then we can go back and see how it is that we can build a campaign that best accomplishes those goals. Hopefully that answers the question.
It does, but I know that Stephen's got his hand up here, and I think he'd like to weigh in. Stephen, does addressable TV work for every client? What is your thought about that, building on what Andrea has just mentioned?
I would say it doesn't necessarily work for every single client. There's kind of a process that we take brands through just to kind of walk through and spec out what they're looking to accomplish. Really, it comes down to a few different things. We really say when you're talking about reaching a targeted audience, there's really a sweet spot where if your audience is too small, then basically if you're looking for one-legged pirates, it's not going to work because you're not going to be able to reach that audience. Your cost of data and technology will actually outweigh your media spend. Whereas if you're trying to reach an audience that's far too broad, you might as well kind of go national and absorb the waste. So there's really a sweet spot that you want to be in. And then it's also about having measurable business objectives on the back end, making sure that you're actually aligning what you're trying to do on the front end with how you're measuring success on the back end. So if we're looking to drive app installs or looking to drive people to a website, that's great. But if there's certain metrics where it might not necessarily be aligned, or we might not necessarily have access to the data to be able to tie it to that exposure data. So at that point, it wouldn't necessarily work. So there's a few different checkboxes. Obviously, there's very limited inventory for 120s, if any. So there's certain categories and certain spots where it just necessarily wouldn't fit for addressable. But those are things that we kind of go through and vet the process as we kind of plan.
Absolutely makes sense. There's no one-size-fits-all in this world, but it's certainly becoming more and more granular, so that's exciting. This next question is for Matt, and it fits perfectly into his wheelhouse because of his expertise at Data Plus Matt. Matt, one of our attendees asks, how big of a data set is required to get to these levels of insight that you've mentioned in your timing matters attribution? How big? Of course, big data is enormous these days, but what are we talking about in terms of size and scale? And were these attributions done under a steady state media campaign? What do you think, Matt? Complex two-part question.
Sure. So Yeah. So let me take the first part of that question and say, more data is almost always better. But we typically work for our clients with data sets that range anywhere from 6-7 million homes measured for national TV campaigns up to 25 to 30 million homes measured, depending on whose data set we're working with and what we're trying to measure. And those size data sets enable us to draw really good conclusions with respect to how different parts of the campaign are driving results for the advertiser. I will say that there is also some dependence in the answer with respect to what are we trying to measure. And so if we think about trying to measure, for example, a conversion where the outcome is visiting a website versus purchasing a car, you can imagine that there are a lot more data points for conversions in my data set for visiting a website versus all of the, versus purchasing a new car. But typically there is now enough data being produced from smart TVs or from partners like Comcast set-top boxes that we get very good results from trying to measure for an advertiser. And to kind of segue into the second part of the question, some of these campaigns and results that we look at are steady state. Some of them are people who are on and off the air. One of the most important parts of doing attribution correctly is the ability to understand baseline conversion and baseline behavior and build a model for that for the advertiser so that you can understand what is incremental and what's being driven by current marketing campaigns.
Got it. Obviously a complex answer for a complex question, but it seems it's all parsable based on today's technology. Great answer. Thank you so much. Well, one of our attendees directs this question to Andrea, and specifically her discussion about set-top boxes. The question is, knowing that set-top boxes are shared by families, how do you differentiate reaching him versus her versus the kids? What do you think, Andrea?
Yeah, hi. So that's a good question. I will say, coming from the world of television in the sense that we often use Nielsen, who had viewer assignment that allowed us to sort of parse that out. Working with set-top box data, that was one of the first questions that we had to make sure we tackled, embraced, and understood. What is the opportunity with set-top box, but then also what are some of the challenges? Here at Comcast, we are set-top box, so it is household exposure, household viewership. We're able to parcel out an actual segment using third-party data like Experian, like Polk. We're very protective of the privacy of our subscriber data, and that's something that I think we should just address full on right now, because I don't want to undermine sort of the issues of privacy and the marrying of big data and the anxiety that could potentially create. We at Comcast take great measure to make sure that we are protecting our subscriber base, our user base, to the utmost. Everything is privacy compliant, it's hashed, and it is not visible to us as to who's watching what within a household. But there are, that again, it goes back to with near census level data at the household level, we're not getting at the person's level per se, but we are able to attach third-party segments that give us the characteristics within the household that we can then derive intention. Something that we also want to address is that our ability to do closed-loop conversion within our environment is also important, where we take our first party, marry it to other first party. But again, being very cognizant of the privacy of consumers on both sides.
That sounds good. Well, Stephen, one of our attendees asks about evolving the data that advertisers use over time, specifically addressable campaigns for a brand might not be assumed to be a perfect mix of data. What do you do to grow with brands specifically with addressable campaigns and evolving data that advertisers use over time, because data obviously changes constantly. Stephen, you got any thoughts about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that definitely commonly comes up. Obviously, there's a lot of choices, a lot of options. We do consider ourselves, for the most part, to be data agnostic. So what we tend to do is allow clients to A, bring their own data with them if it's possible, or B, if I can't, what we try to do is use the closest proxy. So as far as bringing their data with them, that would be partnering with an Experian or a LiveRamp, where we're able to translate digital segments into addressable households in order to target those. So this way we're doing a true apples-to-apples comparison with whatever digital segments or other type of video targeting data that they're using. If that's not the case, we're always happy to provide recommendations. We have tons of partnerships, so it allows us to really kind of come to the table with a specific recommendation that's unique to each category. In each category, obviously, you have some leaders of the pack, so you can kind of rely on us for our insights into that, or we can kind of help you to translate, you as a brand, to translate that data into addressable households.
That sounds good. You know, this question comes from an attendee and throws it out to actually all of our panelists today, which is what actually is addressable TV? It's all addressable in that there are data sets, there are granularity. Can you define a little bit better for our audience, or perhaps a little bit more in detail, what is addressable TV? Anyone like to jump in on this one immediately?
I'll take it first. This is Stephen from One-to-One. For addressable TV, we're talking about taking precise data sets and sending a specific message to a specific household regardless of the content they're consuming. So the ads are dynamically inserted using the set-top box as an ad server to send specific messages to a specific household. Once you've sent that message, we're able to then tie that back and see what that household subsequently did after. Did they buy the car? Did they buy the soup? What did they actually purchase? And then you're able to tie that back so you're actually bringing a true ROI to television.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Anyone else want to jump in on that? Matt, you certainly talked about the ability to discuss, to parse and discern total impressions versus last click problem. Obviously, this is important, right? Addressable TV is essential for getting rid of that last click conundrum.
Yeah, I think about it, addressable TV is one of the great tools in the toolbox for reaching the right people at the right time with the right messaging. And it is one of the ways that a brand can get a more targeted message to the people who are in market. From my point of view, TV comes in a lot of forms. There are, the traditional broadcast delivery paths, the linear indexed or linear optimized TV that is available today is a great tool for reaching audiences in a more focused manner without going all the way to addressable. And obviously the addressability of both the linear multi-channel environment as well as many of the OTT and full episode player and other platforms provides a lot of different ways to get to the right people. The data is something that allows us to put it all back together and understand the impact of each one of those pieces.
So, I love the addressable question, again, because it is so targeted in its approach. It's hyper-targeting at its best, but we also have to think about, again, what are your end goals? And I think that a lot of people can get very excited about addressable, but not consider the pool of inventory or audience that's actually available. And I always go back to the sense of starting with universe bases and understanding, what's even available. So if you're in the market to reach a truck intender, they are only 2% of the current population. Well, then, ultimately, do you want to think about, do I really want to get as narrow? Can Comcast potentially reach 86% of that 2%? Yeah, we can, and it's awesome. It's great that television can now do that. And if we wanted to get to 96%, maybe we add some addressable on top of that, that audience-based buy that's across linear or TV everywhere. But we really just need to make sure that we understand what is our ultimate end goal, and then what are the levers that TV can now bring to the table to get more concise in delivering the consumer, the audience that you're trying to reach. And then we have to think about price, because none of this is easy to do.
No, it's not. Andrea, thank you so much. And that signals the end of our time, unfortunately. Thanks to everyone for attending Ad Age's custom webcast sponsored by Comcast Spotlight. Now, as a thank you, please feel free to download a free fact sheet on audience-based TV buying. That's a free fact sheet on audience-based TV buying. So, finally, on behalf of our guests today, Andrea Zapata from Comcast Spotlight, Matthew Emmons from Data Plus Math, and Stephen Eidelman from One-to-One Media, thanks so much for your time. Have a great and prosperous day.